cheese fingers.
So today should be fun.
All right.
We're talking about Thomas Hobbes, who's so famous in his hometown that every year they elect the Hobbes Philosopher of the Year from among the town's members. Gets to be the official philosopher in residence in Hobbes. So that sounds like a fun village, British village, to go visit. Hobbes. What?
I was just going to make a comment that I suppose it's British, they might not have a stuffed tiger in the office. But
I know. Yeah, people have wondered, is there a relationship between the comic strip Hobbes, Calvin and Hobbes? And they are contemporaries of a sort. And Calvinism was a big issue in, of course, England. I mean, King Charles gets his head chopped off. And that's, by the way, Hobbes he's a tutor to the person who will become Charles II. So there's clearly a relationship there, etc.
I'll have to double check my books, but I think Bill Watterson actually said that he took their names. That was one of the reasons.
Right, but he doesn't actually, as I recall, he
push
doesn't
those
have
philosophy.
any like, he's not adopted Hobbes.
No, it's not like some deep connection.
Calvin is not, clearly not John Calvin. He's clearly not a religious, so. The Presbyterian that is very Scottish, oh my goodness, what's his name, Fox, I think, I just wrote Blast. He titled things Blast. Let me see if I can find first blast of the trumpet. I don't know if that's, yeah, there he is. So John Knox. John Knox, as a Presbyterian, was absolutely infuriated with the idea that there would be women in charge of things.
How scandalous.
I know, it's just, horrible. So he wrote these blasts of the trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women, Scottish reformer John Knox. But there is an interesting connection here, and that is that the Reformation, starting with, of course, Martin Luther's theses, not clearly intended to be a new church, although we officially don't call it a new church, we call it a sect. It's sectarian. So there's one church, the Universal Church, but all the other new churches that develop are referred to as sects. So the Lutheran sect, but obviously the Lutherans refer to it as a church. But it became that. But Luther, of course, meant to reform the church, not start a new one. John Knox, who is influenced by John Calvin and Martin Luther, goes and reforms the Presbyterian. It becomes the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. And what's interesting about this is that the presbyters run the church. So you have a ministry, in fact the presbyters choose the minister as opposed to having it assigned by, say, a bishop or archbishop or cardinal or whatever. So that framework is gone. Instead you have the individual churches basically interviewing individuals that are wanting to be ministers there. And this is, as I understand it, still pretty much the way most Protestant churches do this, is you have maybe 4 or 5 people that are interviewing for the job. They come out, they try out, they have a couple sermons, people vote, And so the people elect who's going to be the minister. And in fact, it's more of a democratic process what the dogmas of the church are, what that individual church believes. So that's kind of interesting. And that turns out to be so successful in the Presbyterian churches that they end up deciding, well, if that works so well, let's run our city government the same way. And so they end up using that same kind of approach with the town. They have an assembly, and that eventually convinces even academics in Edinburgh, and I know I can't say Edinburgh correctly. It's Edinburgh. Edinburgh. Anybody from Scotland know how to say Glasgow? Edinburgh. I don't know how to say.
Isn't it Edinburgh? Something?
Edinburgh. Well, I say Edinburgh, but I'm wrong. The way that the Scots say it, it sounds more like a glottal stop to me. A glottal stop. Sorry, could be funny. However, so that eventually has an impact on the government, so that they decide to have really kind of a democratic elected powers running the town. So what we have is a beginnings of the people rule, right? This becomes essentially the heart of the Whig Party, which eventually will lead a revolt to try to free Scotland from the control of England. They're crushed, and so that doesn't succeed. Scotland remains a part of Great Britain, although you're probably familiar with that actually was a frequent problem. Great Britain was always trying to have more than they. Wales was another issue. The Welsh not really happy, still not, actually, from what I understand, especially because their language tends to be going away, and they're very fond of the fact that the longest word is theirs, right? They own the longest word, right? And in fact, it's a train station, isn't it?
There we go.
Yeah, so buy a ticket for that stop, right?
Good gravy.
Which, that could be funny.
Which translates roughly as St. Mary's Church in the hollow of the White Hazel near a rapid whirlpool, and the Church of St. Ticilio near the Red Cave.
So how do you actually say the word?
Carefully.
Landvira pool
Not going to-
gingith goger up upern drabuf clandis ilio gogogok.
I'm surprised
I
you
know
don't
how
have
to
like
say
a
dragon
like
in Welsh. So
click and you
that's
can play it.
That was probably nowhere even near close to what it's actually translated.
I'm not going to try that.
You can put it in Google Translate.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it'll
copy
say
and
it
paste.
for you.
What does everybody call
I'll let you do that when you get home tonight and you have a couple of hours. However, so the Whigs obviously fail in the revolt in Scotland, although, of course, many of them end up going to the New World, and as academics end up teaching. Thomas Jefferson famously studies with one of them, and guess what? He ends up imbibing this Whig philosophical, political thinking, and it becomes, of course, the root for the revolution, so-called. It's not really a revolution. You didn't really have the American Revolution wasn't really a revolution. It was a breakaway from the home country, but they kept most of the establishment intact. So it wasn't like the French Revolution that overthrew the structure of power, right? They kept it. They just didn't want to be under the king or under the parliament. They wanted to have their own parliament, which they ended up calling a congress, right? But so we get this interesting connection then from the Reformation that says break away from the authority of the church. In my mind, I'm seeing it move up, through Europe and over across to British Isles to Scotland, and then working its way down, right? So I can picture this idea literally moving across the countryside, etc., and it eventually then becomes the grounds for Thomas Hobbes' social contract theory. So Hobbes grows up. His teacher is Francis Bacon. So let me mention Francis Bacon a little bit, because that's pretty significant, really. So Francis Bacon, really quite an important person in his day. Some argue that he's really Shakespeare. And I'm actually very fond of that thesis myself because it irritates a lot of people. It's just fun. But so I'm a Baconite, basically, when it gets to it. So who was the real author of Shakespeare's plays? The argument is that he was, and he used William Shakespeare, who's an actor in the troupe, as his pen name, or as his front, basically, right? Because he's too important to write that kind of trash. And so he has someone else pretend to be that author. Okay? So that's just kind of fun. Yeah, he's Lord Chancellor, etc. So, by the way, he was also in the Tower for a while, because anytime you're in government, it seems like you're also corrupt. There's kind of that connection, that, if you seem to make out well and you're in government, you're obviously corrupt. So obviously we don't have that problem anymore, since we have only billionaires in the cabinet. I'm sure they're going to be completely honest and not do anything that's just to promote their own particular business interests. I'm sure they're going to be completely honest. Ross was just confirmed as the Secretary of Commerce, and the reason he was picked is because he knew how NAFTA worked especially well, because he made all of his billions taking advantage of NAFTA by shipping jobs to Mexico. And since he knows how all that worked, he's the one that's going to be in charge of taking apart NAFTA now. See how that works, right? I'm sure everyone has absolute confidence in his ability to do that. It should be fun. But so, Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon we think of as a beginner of inductive reasoning. In fact, he invents what he calls the new tool, the novum organum, right? The new tool, which is going to help us do much better in our reasoning processes, because up to this point, all of the reasoning processes that the traditional ways of doing things is all deductive. Syllogisms, the belief that Aristotle basically knew everything, and all you have to really do in order to know everything is study enough Aristotle that you too will know everything. And so if you have to do any reasoning at all, what you have to do is just know your premises, and from the premises you'll know the conclusion. There's no need to find out anything new, because everything is already known categorically, right? Well, of course, by now they've discovered that some things Aristotle thought he knew, he didn't. So there seems to be holes now in that system that inspires people to try to come up with new ideas, and what they need is a method that they can use that will be productive, because inductive reasoning is a guess. So how do you improve your guesses? And what Francis Bacon especially points out is that there are idols of the cave, of the tribe, there's a sirbacon.org. Wow, that's interesting. So there are the idols of the tribe. These are beliefs that you have that are in our minds, but have never really been scientifically tested. And so we have to be aware of those. And these influence the whole human race. But there are errors arising from common tendencies to exaggerate, etc. Right? Idols of the cave are those which arise within the mind of the individual, but this is, the mind in that sense is a cavern. And in a way, you think of it as the family, what your individual family taught you that no one really has tested. But Grandma believed it, so I'll believe it, right? The idols of the marketplace, these are things that the whole market, so to speak, the way the business works in the community. People believe different things. But they can also be in error, and so they should be tested. And the funnest of all of these are the idols of the theater, because notice he's also involved in the theater, probably. That's kind of an interesting hypothesis. Right? But also that the theater is associated with the church, because if you've studied how medieval literature used plays, the morality plays, right? We usually call them. They were held on the front porch of the church, which is where we get the modern stage, basically, because the typical church had, the steps going up so that the area where you're entering into the church is elevated over the open area where the audience basically could all stand, right? They didn't have buildings right across the street from the church. They had a big open area. So that was like an area where the crowd could stand, and the actors would be on the steps of the church, and they had even the entrances and exits that are associated with the church doors, where the actors would come in and out and so on. So the early stage, you'd study this, it's associated with the church. So, but the theater is also the dogma associated with the church. That's pretty clear, actually, from his text. And so there's an awful lot of things that the church teaches that isn't scientifically valid. It's just false. And so you have to be aware of all of these things in doing your scientific reasoning. So that's interesting. But let's talk about Hobbes. So there's, by the way, Francis Bacon referred to his student Thomas Hobbes as the brightest of his students. He was very pleased with his abilities and so on. So Thomas Hobbes believes that he was born a twin of fear, because if you remember the movie where Elizabeth is on her white horse with the red hair flowing, riding in a panic up and down the coast, waiting for the Spanish Armada to attack. She has no idea how they're going to manage to fight off all these Spaniards, because she's gathered a really small, pitiful army. So it looks like if the Spanish arrive, they're just going to be crushed. But meanwhile, fortunately, Sir Walter Raleigh is out there leading an attack by the British Navy against the Armada. And fortunately, the weather has turned bad, so the Armada has linked itself all up ship to ship in one big mass of ships in order to weather out the storm. And Sir Walter Raleigh lights 4 of their ships on fire, and you remember the movie, and he sends the ships, they literally ride the ships in towards the Armada and then jump off and swim back, right? So of course it becomes one great big forest fire, basically, and the whole Armada sinks, and yay, it's a miracle, and England was saved from the invasion of the Spanish Armada, which also sunk the Spanish treasury, by the way, because an awful lot of their money that they had gotten from the gold, from their taking all the gold that they could find in the Americas, went into the purchase of those ships, and so, boy, that was a real disaster for Spain, and pretty much signals the beginning of the decline of the Spanish as a world empire, and of course the beginning of the Elizabethan power of England, right? In any case, Hobbes is born that day. His mom is in a panic, not knowing what's going to happen. Literally, she could see the Spanish Armada off the coast, and as a result of her fear, she ends up having Thomas early. So he claims that he was born a twin of fear. That's kind of interesting. Did I get that right? Anybody? I'm going on memory, so, and my memory, I'm discovering, is getting older. So, in any case, he feels like his whole life is a string of fearful events. So the fear thing sticks with him, and it's absolutely amazing that he refers to life as nasty, brutish, and short, and yet he lives till he's, 92. He has a pension, and he plays tennis. So his life was